Good morning, everyone. It's such a tremendous honor and real pleasure to be with you here today. I love New York City. It's a city with very special meaning for many of us. You get a very definite sense of place here. There's this energetic vibration that you can feel as soon as you land at LaGuardia. As you drive into Manhattan, your adrenaline starts to kick in, your pulse quickens, your eyes get a little wider, your heart beats a little faster. My niece is actually here with me here today, and she will tell you that I am actually the world's slowest walker. Glacial speeds, really. But in New York, the energy here inspires me to walk fast. I mean, I kind of have to, otherwise I'm going to get run over. About a year ago, I did receive this phone call from Anthony inviting me to speak at this conference. Thank you, Anthony, for believing in me. He had given me the very broad stroke theme of person, place, or thing and told me to meditate on it. I honed in on the concept of place. I've always been fascinated by things that reflect a sense of place and the various ways that you can feel it, you can taste it, and you can experience it. It's what drew me to wine, which in essence is a liquid translation of place. I live in Chicago now, but the place that I was born is Monterey. Yay, Gary, my fellow Montereyan. My parents are actually from the Fiji Islands, and my great-grandparents were from India, having come to Fiji as indentured laborers. When I was 11, I had accompanied my mother on a trip to Fiji, and after visiting friends and families for about 2 weeks, we returned home with our suitcases stuffed with all kinds of edible contraband. As the U.S. Customs agent began rifling through our things and pulling out these oily bottles of pickled mango and jackfruit, my mother had conveniently decided that she no longer spoke English, leaving me to serve as translator and negotiator. Part of the smuggled items were Fijian clams, sourced directly from the river in the village that my mother grew up in. Since we lived in Monterey, a place known for its wonderful seafood, I didn't understand why didn't we just buy the clams at Fisherman's Wharf instead of me risking juvenile detention. My mother gave me this look of pity and told me that the clams from her village were special, that the river that she had played in as a kid gave the clams a unique taste and flavor. They were the taste of home, and nothing would ever come close. I could sense her disappointed in me that I didn't understand this. My mother had just given me an important lesson on terroir, a concept that I would spend a lot of time studying in my pursuit to become a Master Sommelier. Terroir is a French word that roughly translates to earth and soil, but in a broader context, it refers to the unique combination of factors, including the soil, the climate, the aspect and the location, the sunlight, and really anything else that could possibly differentiate one piece of land from another. And just as the taste of those clams from my mother's village could not be replicated anywhere else, the same rule applies to wine. Pinot Noir grown in a small patch of land in Burgundy produces a vastly different wine versus one from a vineyard grown high above the fog line in Sonoma. Is one terroir better than other? Well, that's a very subjective question, but I do know that if you want to become a Master Sommelier, terroir is vital. Part of the exam involves identifying the country, region, grape variety, and vintage of 6 wines in a blind tasting with at least 75% accuracy. Without those markers indicating a sense of place, it's really difficult to tell one Chardonnay from another. In other words, without terroir, you're toast. And I'm not a person who likes to lose or admit defeat. In 3rd grade, I came home with the 2nd place ribbon for an art contest that I had entered at school. My mother asked me why the blue ribbon I was holding in my hand didn't say first. Turns out Ricky Bobby's dad and my mom had a lot in common. If you're not first, you're last, shake and bake. Well, that was the immigrant work ethic that was drilled into me. If you put your head down and you worked hard and you didn't ask too many questions, and if you didn't feel too many feelings, you could make it to the top and you could be the best. If you failed, it simply meant you hadn't worked hard enough. Those lessons were hardwired into me, and for a while, they served me quite well. I moved to Chicago when I was 23 to take over the wine program at Everest. A year later, I was also nominated for a James Beard Award for wine service. At the age of 26, after years of applying that immigrant work ethic and grit, I had passed the Master Sommelier exam, becoming the youngest woman and the only South Asian ever to do so. Thanks. Shortly after passing my test, I got a call from a producer to audition to host a restaurant review show on our local PBS station called Check Please, and lo and behold, I got the gig. It was as if I could do no wrong. So when I turned 38, I'm like, why not open a restaurant? You know, they should really put a warning label on these things. And think about that one Just Say No to Drugs commercial from the 80s with the egg. This is your brain. This is your brain after opening a restaurant. Any questions? Opening and running a restaurant is by far the hardest yet most rewarding thing I have ever done. You know, restaurants are a lot like children. Once you have them and realize what you've done, it's too late to push them back in. But very much like children, they will stretch you and they will challenge you in ways you never thought possible. You're simultaneously frustrated, you're tired, and you're exhausted, but something continues to drive you in the name of love, in the name of passion, and then in the name of never giving up. You learn how hard others are willing to work for you and for each other. You learn how great it can feel to make your guests feel happy and how devastating it is when you don't. It's exciting work in so many ways, but it will also send you to your breaking point. And indeed, by far, the most significant outcome of my life as a restaurateur is that it literally pushed me into therapy. I had gotten to the point where whatever I was doing was no longer working, and I knew I needed help, professional help. And if you know anything about Indians, it's that we don't do therapy. And you can imagine how desperate I was to feel better. It just seemed that no matter how hard I worked or how hard I tried, it was just never enough. For the first time in my life, I felt like a failure. And without that feeling of winning under my wings, I no longer knew who I was. I just remember those early days in therapy feeling absolutely nothing. Like I'd been walking around with a mask on my face. I had this overwhelming sense of just emptiness. But where did that feeling of numbness come from? Why couldn't I feel anything? Those are the questions that I've been trying to answer as I've dissected myself in order to understand how I came to be this way. For the last few years, I've been on this journey to examine and understand my own terroir. Growing up, I had this instinctive sense to create two versions of myself. One version that was acceptable for my family, where I didn't act too American, and another for the American world, where I wasn't too Indian. When I was in the 6th grade, my mother had packed an Indian lunch for me, curried potatoes wrapped in a roti. As I unwrapped the foil for my Indian burrito, the smell of curry hit the courtyard, and the kids all started making fun of me. Ugh, what's that smell? Gross. Why is it yellow? Joey Maxwell, the boy that I had this huge crush on, told me that my lunch smelled like body odor. As hungry as I was, I quietly put my lunch away and I drank my Capri Sun. Home was the flip side version of the same. My aunties and uncles warned me not to become a coconut. Brown on the outside, white in the center. I was getting these messages that I couldn't just be myself. Huge parts of me needed to stay hidden depending on who I was with and what I was doing. And that's just kind of how I grew up and came to be, straddling both worlds, never finding sure footing in either. 6th grade lunch fiasco aside, food has always been my happy place. As a kid, I would binge watch cooking shows on PBS, and I would dream about traveling to all those faraway places to eat all that delicious food I would see on TV. As Tina Fey would say, I want to go there. Food was my bridge to experiencing other cultures and allowed me to escape into a world that was far beyond the confines of our little living room in Monterey. Jacques Pepin and Julia Child took me to France. Martin Yan allowed me to explore China. Lydia and Marcella led me through Italy. And a sari-clad Mater Joffrey told me that Indian food was indeed worth celebrating. Joey Maxwell could just suck it. It was my love of food that led me to pursue a career in restaurants and eventually wine as well. When I was born, my father had worked as a dishwasher. His profession, and as such, the restaurant business, is literally stamped on my birth certificate. My calling had been established at birth. Earlier this year, I happened to catch Hasan Minhaj's new show, The Patriot Act, on Netflix. Hasan Minhaj is a South Asian guy. Perhaps you saw him on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart for many years. And last year, Netflix very smartly decided to give him his own show. So I'm sitting there, I'm watching this guy who looked like my cousin Amal, being unapologetically Indian. He's fusing global political commentary with skits about Indian kids named Raj and uncles named Ravi. I have an Uncle Ravi. I was shocked by how effortlessly he was navigating both of our worlds, not having to choose one side over the other. He wasn't being too Indian, he wasn't being too American, he was just being himself. And he was funny. He talked about things that I could relate to, experience that I also had as an Indian kid growing up in America. I was laughing and connecting with him at the level of my DNA. I remember thinking to myself, who had given him permission to do that, to just be himself? But I was mostly taken aback by my own question of needing permission. Was I waiting for some mythical Oprah to come down from the sky and anoint me? You, Alpana, can now be yourself. I would actually be okay with that. I really like Oprah. But it seems that I was waiting for some green light, for some hall pass to just be me. And I didn't realize it until I saw an unapologetic version of who I could be being reflected back to me. For someone who has spent her entire career studying a sense of place, I had disregarded my own terroir. It was that duality of having to play two versions of myself, one Indian and one American, that had finally caught up with me. That was the feeling of nothingness and that vital something that I felt was missing. For my need for acceptance, it had made me feel invisible. In my quest to assimilate, I had erased major portions of myself. I had spent so much time studying the food and drinks of other cultures, yet how was it that I knew next to nothing of my own? This was a huge revelation to me, especially at a time in our country where much of our national conversation revolves around where some of us come from and whether we have a right to occupy the space we're in. Each of us has come about in our own personal terroir, that unique combination of growing conditions, family climate, cultural exposure, and ancestral roots that can't be replicated anywhere else. It's what makes us who we are. It's what made me what I am. And I'm talking the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it. And when we deny these huge portions of ourselves, either by our own accord or through these insidious messages that we receive in our society, that is when we lose ourselves. That is when we are not able to bring our unique contributions to the table, those unique gifts that truly make this country great. Some of you are thinking, well, Alpana, what about those of us who grew up in a culture of intolerance? There's a lot of bad terroir out there. And I agree with you, but that conversation is far beyond the scope of the time that I've been given today. There is some truly evil stuff happening out there in our world, and there's no excuse for it. But despite all of that, I choose to believe that most people are fundamentally good, that the darkness can only be driven out by the light. And in order for true change to come about, We have to first look at what currently exists, and that begins by talking to each other, by listening to each other, whether we may agree with that person or not. Change begins by trying to understand where each of us is coming from, by understanding and honoring each other's terroir. So now I have a sense of where I came from, but where do I go from here? Rather than looking forward, I'm looking around, and I find myself at an interesting intersection in my life. Last year, the 2 of the 3 restaurants I started closed. If opening a restaurant fries your brain, closing one, well, that one pierces your heart and it rips it right out. I'm also 42 now, and they don't hand out 40 over 40 awards. Even though I feel like now is when I'm really starting to do my best work. I feel like I'm just getting started here. But for the first time in my life, I don't really have a concrete plan on what to do next, and I'm okay with it. You don't always have to know what comes next. I'm letting that next thing come to me. I'll know the right thing when I see it, when I feel it. I am planning a trip to India, my first ever. I'm writing, and I'm discovering those parts of myself that I've long denied. I would also very much like to open another restaurant, but this time, a place that leads with an intention. You're going to hear a lot about intention today, I have a funny feeling. An intention that is far greater than just the goal of making money. Anything, if you ever start something with the intention of making money, I can guarantee you, you're going to fail. That's a bad intention. I want to open a place that tells a story, my story, and I want you to be able to feel it as soon as you walk in. As for the accolades and awards, I'm always going to want to win. That's just who I am, and I'd be lying if I said otherwise. But my new definition of success now includes just being me, the authentic, unapologetic, whole version of me. I had this epiphany recently that watching Mother Joffrey when I was a little kid did more than just tell me how great Indian food could be. Seeing her on TV gave me example of how great I could be. You have to first see it to become it, and through Mother Joffrey, I have manifested the same reality for myself. I am now an Indian woman on PBS talking about food. I have come full circle, and I now reflect that same possibility to others who are just like me, that we don't need to shape-shift and deny who we are in order to follow our dreams. Representation and inclusion is a lot like Glinda the Good Witch from Wizard of Oz. It taps you on the shoulder and tells you the power has been inside of you this entire time. Just click your heels and say to yourself, there's no place like home. Maybe this is what my mother was trying to teach me when she turned me into a clam mule. That there is indeed no place like home, and that there is no taste like home either. Thank you.